Okay, great. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. Again, this is Amy Guthrie, the Director of Technology at the Clery Center, so I'm going to be acting as a back-end facilitator to support this session. So if you have any issues with your sound throughout, or if you're having trouble seeing anything, you can use this tech support submission for questions. It's a Q&A area, and it's right to the right of the slides and then down next to the group discussion area. And that's where you can interact with us privately. So you can do that for any technical issues, or you can also do that for any questions that you want to submit during the session that you would like only our presenters to see, and we can address them throughout the session. And then as you see, as you're all introducing yourselves, please continue to do so. It's entirely optional, but we enjoy being able to interact with you and see who's in the session, and you'll be able to ask questions in this group discussion box where you see everyone introducing themselves. So please go ahead and continue to use that. We'll be using that throughout the session to take in questions. And also we will be providing links for you to various resources. So we will definitely make sure that we mention that when we're posting links in there, as it can fill up pretty quickly with the amount of people on today. And thank you for joining us. I know there's a lot going on right now, and so I appreciate you all taking time out of your schedules to join us for this session today. And we're hoping to cover some really important discussion areas. And with that, I just want to remind you that we do have a copy of the slides. There isn't a whole lot of material for today, as this is a discussion-based format, but we did want to let you know that that's there for you in the Files pod directly to the right of the presentation slides. And then with that, I'm going to hand things over to my colleagues Abigail Boyer and Laura Egan, who are going to be facilitating the discussion today. So again, thank you for joining us, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy. Good afternoon, good morning, folks. Thank you all for joining us today. This is Laura Egan, Senior Director of Programs at Clery Center. And before I do a little bit more of an intro, I'm just going to let my colleague Abigail also introduce herself.
Hi, good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Abigail Boyer, and I'm the Associate Executive Director here at Clery Center.
Thanks so much, Abby. And I just, want to echo Amy's sentiments. Amy captured it all pretty well and succinctly just now, but we really do want to first acknowledge, the unprecedented time we are all in as our country and our world is in the middle of this pandemic and crisis time. And so we really first just want to thank you all for the work that you have and continue to do on your campuses, particularly those of you that are currently on campus and working in people-facing roles, whether that be health workers, law enforcement, custodial workers, package delivery folks. We know that all of you might be doing that work right now in some capacity, and we really just want to extend our gratitude to you all for the work that you do to keep all of us safe every day, but in particular at this time of uncertainty and crisis. And so thank you for all of that work. We also really just want to take a moment to acknowledge that this is a really difficult time for everybody. And so our intention with today's call is to provide a community conversation where we're starting to talk through some concerns that we have identified coming through to us as questions, some areas where we might not necessarily have answers or best practices because all of those things are evolving in real time. And so our goal really is to provide, again, that shared space for us all to strategize and talk together and develop resources and thoughts together. Abby and I are coming to you with some ideas that are not just our own. We've definitely worked together and done our own research before bringing our thoughts and ideas to you all here today. And that has been in collaboration with other folks in the education field, including folks that are doing campus safety work and Clery work. But we thought it would be a really helpful time, now that we all might be a little bit more removed from the immediacy of change, to take a moment to reassess. And we want to share with you some of the resources we've already been providing, whether it's our blog posts or just collections of other tools and guides and handouts, and then also responses to some frequently asked questions that we've been getting, particularly in connection to not just Clery, but Clery in the greater context of overall campus safety, and how procedures and policies might all be a little bit more flexible or are required to be a little bit more flexible and nimble right now for you. So as Amy said earlier, this is not a ton of slides. We're really just providing you with our faces so that you have an idea as a reminder of who's chatting with you. But most of the content will really come from you all, from the questions that have been submitted ahead of time, so thank you to those of you that have done that, and then to any that come up through the call. Certainly we have a large number of folks. People are still joining right now, and we're up to about 300. So we will be not able to answer all questions in real time. However, we do encourage you to ask them because they help for us to coalesce our responses for you. So while we might not be able to get to your particular question during the call, it is helpful for us to get an idea of what other things might be coming up for you as we talk today. And so that will help guide our future resources and strategy sessions that we hold. So with that, Abby, is there anything else you would like to say before we get into our agenda for this call this afternoon?
No, I think you summarized that perfectly. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So for those of you joining us, what we're trying to do today is, like I said, cover some commonly asked questions that we've received over the past 2 to 3 weeks or so. So we'll be talking in general about alerting and balancing the idea of overcommunication and transparency. We're going to talk in general about reporting considerations and questions that have come up with reporting crime procedures, whether that's connected to general crime reporting, hate crime reporting, domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, or stalking reporting, and how those pieces might have different contexts considering your daily crime log and things like that at this time. And then we'll talk about ways you can best support students and employees through virtual prevention and education training and resources. So that's our agenda of hopefully topics that we'll cover through this call this afternoon. We are going to incorporate some of the questions that have been submitted to us ahead of time as well when we get to each of those topics. Please know, too, that this is being recorded, and so we will share this recording with you all. If you have colleagues that were not able to join during this call today, and that might be very well because our registration capacity was also maxed out for this call, please navigate to our website, and there is a way for you to sign up to receive a recording. So we'll remind you of that at the end as well, but know that that is an option that exists. Lastly, as part of this primer, just know that there are all levels of experience joining us on this call today. So we are trying to approach each topic from a general baseline education about what we're talking about as it connects to Clery, and then answering more COVID-19 specific questions that are coming up about it. So if you are finding yourself lost, or if you're finding yourself way beyond what we're talking about, please just hang in there until we get to the meat of these COVID-19 related questions. And if anything we are saying is spurring further questions for you, please jot those down, send us an email. That's why our email addresses are up here, and we will get to you in due time this week for sure. Okay, so the first topic we want to talk through is alerting requirements under the Clery Act. So just as a primer, the Clery Act guides how institutions share information in an emergency. There are 2 types of alerting requirements under the Clery Act. So there are timely warnings and emergency notifications. And the way I like to distinguish between these 2 types of alerts, because they certainly are separate and distinct, is that a timely warning is reserved for a situation that has taken place, that has the potential to occur again, and certainly that is the standard Clery Act crime occurring in Clery geography that was reported to a CSA. That's the minimum requirement. If that type of situation poses a serious or ongoing threat, then your institution is required to share information to aid in the prevention of similar crimes. So timely warnings are that set of Clery circumstances, something has happened, there's the potential it could occur again, you want to inform your campus community about that so they can make a decision about whether or not they need to change their behavior, whether or not they need to report information. They might want to consider a couple of things. That's a timely warning. An emergency notification is sent when there is an immediate threat to the health or safety of your campus community, and you need folks at your campus community to change their behavior now as a result of that immediate threat. Now, certainly, that has been the standard, before now. What we are facing now with coronavirus and with COVID-19 is essentially an extended immediate threat because of this idea of how long somebody could possibly pass along symptoms, but pass along the virus, but be asymptomatic. The peak time in different parts of the country of when the outbreak will be at its highest is differing. So we're all looking at certain regions of the country with a lot of attention because that could very well be your area of the country soon, or you are in those hotspots right now. And then, the outbreak itself or the disease, the virus itself can take and exist for a long period of time. So this idea of looking at an extended immediate threat is hard to wrap our brains around a little bit. But we want to hope to give you some guidance as to how to best handle sharing information with your campus community, particularly as many, if not all of you, are now operating with remote campus communities or virtual interactions with those campus communities in light of the requirement. So in addition to timely warnings, the emergency notification requirement requires institutions to have a policy in place that communicates the procedures the institution will use to immediately notify the campus community upon the confirmation of a significant emergency or dangerous situation that involves that immediate threat. So first on the list in the Handbook for Campus Safety and Security Reporting is an outbreak of meningitis, norovirus, or other serious illness. So it's a prime example of something that would constitute an immediate threat to health or safety. So many of you have been asking us questions connected to this idea of, well, we have already issued these emergency notifications. That's how people essentially subscribed, willingly or less willingly, to this idea of moving off campus, working remotely, living remotely for the rest of the semester. But now we're in a place where we don't know how or how much to include follow-up information, particularly as now we might be starting to get information about members of our campus community that have been diagnosed with COVID-19, and to what extent are we obligated to share that information and in what capacity. So in general, emergency notifications always require follow-up. Such follow-up does not need to be sent in an emergency notification itself. However, that context might differ depending on your current campus situation and your location in the country. Because right now, we're talking about situations where we as a country are not having healthcare workers have the capacity to do that contact tracing, or that idea of identifying somebody that has been diagnosed and then determining all of the people they've interacted with and in what context and in what spaces. So right now, sending notifications or updates like that to your campus community can be helpful in serving that purpose. That does not necessarily mean that that notification needs to be an emergency notification. That can be a general communication to your campus community. And I know at this point, you might be saying, well, Laura, what really is the difference between that right now? We use the same methodology to send that, and the way people react is how it's interpreted as an emergency or not. And I totally hear you. But if there are certain banners or language or the way in which you send that information that differs, you might want to start thinking about, are there other ways we can send those types of updates that don't look exactly like an emergency notification? But again, I'm kind of putting the cart before the horse a little bit here. What we want to really emphasize for you is this is a really important time to be looking at and examining what your policy says and what factors you are taking into consideration to determine whether or not you have that significant emergency that warrants that emergency notification. And sure, it might not be the best time to do this right now, but if you at all are noticing, well, wow, there's like a gap here, I'm not quite sure how we make that determination, or we're not really explicit about the factors that we use when we are making that kind of a decision, really great time to jot down a note about that. There is one resource that is included within the Campus Safety Connections webpage that we're essentially linking you all to. Campus Safety Connections is a newsletter that we send to our campus community, to our mailing list essentially at Clery Center, which is essentially our campus community. And the most recent one we sent has a collection of a bunch of different resources connected to COVID. And one of those is a lessons learned document essentially by a campus who has taken the time to acknowledge already the lessons they've learned in documenting or not documenting their decision making or other pieces connected to getting information out and procedures that they put in place in response to the outbreak of coronavirus. So that would be a really fabulous thing to check out in relation to this. And again, that's that document that we'll be linking to. We did in the beginning and we'll link to it again. So some pieces that we just want you to take into consideration are determining whether or not knowing that somebody at your campus community has been diagnosed, is that enough to warrant another emergency notification? Is that enough to warrant follow-up communication? That is a decision you all ultimately need to make. And you need to be able to defend with policy or procedure, ideally. And if you don't have that policy or procedure right now, we would at least recommend coming up with some sort of documentation of why you made the decision you did now. And if it's not supported by policy because you've never dealt with that type of situation before, that would be something I would note in your own documentation. We know, too, that it's so crucial, and I'm sure you all already are staying in touch with local, state, and county emergency response work and your public health officials to help you in determining whether or not that kind of information is critical to share and in what capacities. Some folks have been asking, I see questions coming in about whether or not you need to send a timely warning for diagnoses of COVID-19. And again, I would just remind you, timely warnings are really reserved for those Clery crimes or other crimes if your policy extends that have occurred that pose a serious or ongoing threat. The emergency notification function is designed for that immediate threat to health or safety. So that I would not necessarily think of any of these notifications as timely warnings as much as emergency notifications. This is perhaps a little tangential, but important to note also that there might very well be crimes that warrant a timely warning happening at your campus community or within your Clery geography at this time. Unfortunately, campuses might be soft targets right now because so many people are not there. Or there just might be things that happen that you would, according to your policy, issue the timely warning. So just as you would still issue a timely warning if people were not on campus because it was a break period or because it was over the summer, but in terms of the context of the situation, it warrants a serious or ongoing threat, you very well might be issuing a timely warning. Abby, would you add anything else to alerting before I pass it on to you to talk about the medical institution caveat here?
No, I think you covered a lot of those details. I was just plugging into the chat box because I think one of the things that's coming up both in this discussion today, but also in conversations we've been having with campuses, is that distinction between timely warning and emergency notification. So one of the things that I wanted to note there is that page 6.2 of the handbook is what talks about exactly what you were just highlighting, the emergency notifications requirement speaking to an immediate threat to health or safety of the campus community. And the first one in those examples is outbreak of meningitis, norovirus, or other serious illness. So if you're using this as an opportunity to also bring some of this information back and share it with others within your campus community as you're making those decisions, that's a good reference there. The other thing, and I was multitasking a bit to try to get that information in the chat box, so please, Laura, call me out if I'm repeating anything that you already said, but I know some of the other questions that were coming in were specific to, well, what if the college is closed, no students on campus? So I think before we even go into kind of the medical pieces, it's good to reiterate that just because your campus is closed doesn't necessarily mean that there's no one on campus. So I would really encourage you to think about what that means for your community, because we know that for many of the institutions that we're working with, the students may not physically be on campus, but certain essential personnel are on campus, and for many institutions, there might still be some students that are staying on campus because it's not safe for them to leave for whatever reason. So even though it's not the full student population, there are still individuals available within the community. And so kind of a key takeaway is that these Clery Act requirements are going to still apply, even though the circumstances of your community may have changed. And we know that it can be really hard to teach Clery as you're navigating a pandemic, but we want you to have a sense of what are some of the policies that we should really be looking to and considering as we are making these evaluations within our own campus community. The other thing I just want to expand upon that I think Laura touched on, but I want to make sure is clear, is that because emergency notifications, because as a part of sending out emergency notifications, you're also expected to do updates to your community. A lot of your communication now may be in the form of one of those updates. So for many institutions, that initial emergency notification may have already occurred. Most often, what we're seeing, it's because there's been a confirmed incident within the campus community, or for many of our institutions, it might be that there is a student or an employee that had known exposure to someone who was confirmed to have COVID-19. So if that emergency notification already went out to the campus community, now chances are most of your communications are going to be in that form of the updates that Laura was talking about. So you'll want to make sure that as you do that, you are still linking to that original emergency notification to help contextualize why are we sharing this information now, why do we think it's relevant in relation to this immediate threat to the health or safety of the campus community, so that you have demonstrated that link or that tie as to why you're sharing the information, which is not only an issue of compliance, but is also just helpful and valuable to your community, so they're having access to all of the information that they need at that time. Before I kind of redirect just to talk a little bit more specifically about medical institutions, I want to pause there in case, Laura, there's anything you'd want to respond to what I just said, or any questions I might have missed during that time period.
No, you touched on everything. I was just going to add one question that came up was, would a post on an established COVID-19 website suffice as an update? And I think that's a great question, because many of you, I think, have established temporary pages to address all campus things related to COVID-19. So my response to that, and Abby, I would invite you to chime in here, would be that update on that website would suffice if there is a mechanism that tells people to go there for that update, or that the update has been added. Because otherwise, how do you know to go to that page for the website? I mean, sure, people might be, automatically checking on their own every day, but I would think it would be cleaner if there was a way to indicate an update has been, posted to this website. Because I get that. I get the idea of wanting to centralize information and keep it in one spot, but you just want to think about the idea of people getting the hint or getting the tip off to go to that website to see that update.
Yeah, absolutely. And that really echoes a lot of what you see in other places of the handbook, which is the Department of Education expects a multimodal response. And unfortunately, we're living that right now for many of our campuses, because you might have seen ways in which it's been harder with technology. I see even in our thread right now, the links are working for some people and not others. And I know even our webinar platform said they're getting kind of the highest participation they ever had. It's influencing how and if the technology is working. And so recognizing that, having that multimodal approach, making sure that the emergency notification is going out in another mechanism, even if it's pointing back to that central website or database, will be really important to make sure that the information is getting out there. One of the things Laura mentioned is that certainly a lot of the information we're sharing today is based on questions that we've been hearing from all of you, and conversations that we've been fortunate to have with a lot of other organizations doing this work, like NASA and IACLEA, and we've been paying attention to information from other individuals like SUNY webinars that we're going to reference, NACOP, and this next piece of information is also based on a recent conversation we had with some folks over at Cozen O'Connor. And so we just want to highlight that as an opportunity where we are staying connected, certainly, to a lot of organizations. We hope that you all are doing the same and staying connected not only to organizations but to one another. And so I really value that as part of this group discussion. It gives you the opportunity to share information about what has this experience been like for you, or how have you responded, in relation to some of the questions that are coming in today. So please know that based on kind of the function of this discussion, it doesn't necessarily have to be just us answering the questions, although we're happy to do so, but do feel free to chime in and respond to one another if you have thoughts that you'd want to share based on your own experience, because we know you all are living some of these things right now. We just wanted to do a quick highlight, I think, just to add to a lot of what Laura was saying in relation to medical institutions, because we know that a lot of, especially if we're thinking about updating information, this might be particularly relevant for institutions that have medical centers on campus. And I know that on an ongoing basis, as we work with institutions that do have medical centers on campus and are navigating their Clery responsibilities in those spaces, we know that we often have campuses saying we are really trying to educate on an ongoing basis. What does that mean for us in terms of who might be a CSA in that environment, and what information are we collecting on a regular basis, or how do we make sure that they're informed about what our Clery requirements are. So just to echo some of what Laura was saying, you'll want to particularly be paying attention to this if you are a medical institution, because we know that a lot of those centers are being used to help address the needs related to COVID-19 on campus. So you'll want to think about what information are we gathering that might be informing those updates, particularly in those spaces. So I think one thing that Laura mentioned were things like screening questions. Are there questions that, as a part of their practice or protocol, are going to help us determine whether or not that individual had contact with other staff or individuals on campus who might need that information? Emergency notifications have the option of being segmented. So some of your updates might not necessarily be going to the entire campus community, but rather specific individuals that you might think are more at risk for whatever reason. And that is certainly an example of that. So is there any information that's being gathered within those spaces that if we do learn that that individual has also had contact with a public safety officer, or many of the different people that Laura named at the start of this webinar who are still physically showing up on campus and helping to serve members of our community in various different ways, that information is going to be important to know from an emergency notification standpoint, so that you can determine what additional information should we share and how do we segment this. So really looking at, are there channels of information that's being shared across departments right now, and also recognizing that, again, for some of your campuses, even though you may have removed to remote education, we know of a lot of campuses where there are still some students that are staying on campus because it was unsafe for them to try to relocate, or they weren't able to relocate for other reasons. So also consider whether or not you have a list, and you being whoever's responsible for issuing those emergency notifications, do you have a list of who is still remaining on campus, so that should you move to more segmented communication, or should there be a reason for segmented communication, you know how to reach those individuals specifically that are still remaining within your campus community. And then this is kind of the start to some of these conversations that we imagine will be happening over the next couple of weeks. But we just wanted to note that we've heard from some of you, and we've been seeing certainly a lot of articles about institutions that are adapting their residential facilities to become medical facilities to help support, unfortunately, the increased need and the immense need to respond to COVID-19 cases. So if that's happening within your campus community, also think about that in relation to how you're communicating about the institution's COVID-19 response and updated protocols if they are in place. So does your campus community recognize that these changes are happening in terms of how your residential halls are being used, and how that might influence certainly your own institutional response on campus? So I'll do a quick pause there just to see if there are any questions that I missed. Laura, please let me know, or if there's anything else I can expand on, and if not, then I'll certainly hand it back over to you to talk a little bit more about daily crime logs.
Yeah, Abby, one question I just wanted to bring up was one that we had received ahead of time that was asking if there was any leeway under the law regarding the requirement to immediately notify the campus upon confirmation. The question was asking if 24 hours or more after receiving confirmation that a member of the campus community is confirmed to have the virus and could possibly have exposed the campus or segments of it within that requirement under the law. So Basically, the question is asking if you have to notify the campus community within 24 hours of finding out that somebody within your campus community has been diagnosed with COVID-19. So the Department of Education has not communicated any, quote, leeway, but the law also doesn't explicitly communicate an expectation that there is a 24-hour time frame within which you're issuing the emergency notification. So again, this might be a question that might benefit from some more one-on-one technical assistance to understand a little bit more about the context within this specific situation, because there might be some broader questions related to what constitutes confirmation. But ultimately, this is an example of why that requirement exists. The institution, is getting information out as soon as possible once you have it. So that said, though, there might be some campus-based questions here related to a report where someone is concerned they may have, COVID-19 versus the confirmation that someone does. So again, there is not necessarily a requirement that notification goes out within 24 hours of, confirmation, but what I would look back to, what we would suggest at Clery Center you look back to, is what constitutes confirmation of a significant emergency at your institution, and how flexible or nimble are you right now with what that might look like, considering this concept of an extended emergency. So that might be something that is evolving, but there is no, requirement that we have heard yet around an expectation that there is a, within a certain amount of hours X. What we're really looking to is, once you have information and you can confirm that there is that significant emergency, what are you doing with it? Okay. And like
Mark,
we're saying in the discussion. Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to say I did see one more question come in that I think would make sense to tie in here, which is the question of should we notify or update the campus after every individual confirmation, which I think is a really good one and one that we're hearing a lot right now. So because emergency notification already has a built-in structure for you to be providing updates related to the emergency notification, what we would encourage you to do is to rely on that structure to be sharing additional information. So for emergency notification, you're sending that emergency notification upon confirmation of that immediate threat to the health or safety of the campus community. So that initial emergency notification would be ultimately the emergency notification that's going out to represent a confirmation of a threat related to COVID-19. Therefore, those updates that you're doing in relation to that might not necessarily be for every individual confirmation after that, especially because the information might be very fluid. You might be getting it on an ongoing basis. But those updates should be happening. So that might be every 24 hours. That might be within a span of a couple of hours, depending on if you're getting a lot of information at once in relation to multiple confirmed cases. So I wouldn't think of it as a new emergency notification every time you get a confirmed case, but certainly it should be at least that one emergency notification if you have confirmation of the threat, and then ongoing updates to connect back to that emergency notification as to patterns you might be seeing in the community, additional steps that members of the community should take, or updates that ultimately are going to help in relation to the safety of the campus community. So thank you for that, because I know that one's been a thread that we're seeing quite a bit in questions that we're receiving elsewhere as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Abby. So I know we're halfway through our hour here, so we want to make sure we do touch on the other topics that we've been getting some questions about, and then we can hopefully have a little bit of time at the end to see if there are any other questions coming in from you all. And thank you all for your patience with the links. Like I think we've explained enough in the discussion pod, there was just a touch of high traffic, and one of the links just was missing one backslash. So I think folks have figured all that out now. But I just wanted to make sure that it was clear that the links we're sharing with you are from our own website. So if you just are bookmarking our website, that might be helpful for you today and in the future as we continue to update with resources. We've already published 2 blogs underneath the blogs tab, so that might be one place to look. And then under news and events is another tab where we've been keeping up-to-date information as well. So just hopefully that's helpful. But we also, my colleagues Megan and Amy also indicated that after the webinar today, we will send out these links that we've been including in the discussion pod, so you'll have that as well. Okay, so our next topic is around daily crime logs. So we basically have just gotten the question, do daily crime logs still apply considering everybody is remote? And so the short answer to that is yes, daily crime logs are still in play if you have a campus security department or campus police department which is basically the underlying requirement for maintaining a daily crime log. So just as a quick primer, again, daily crime log entries include all crimes reported to the campus police or security department for your required geographic areas, which includes Clery geography and your institution's patrol jurisdiction. So if you have a security department or a campus police department, you're maintaining that daily crime log, which reflects crimes reported to your security department or campus police department that occurred within your campus's patrol jurisdiction, which should also include your campus's Clery geography probably, but might not in some cases. So it should be Clery geography and patrol jurisdiction. Your crime log entries include the date the crime was reported, the date and time the crime occurred, the nature of the crime, the general location of the crime, and the disposition of the complaint if that is known. A question that's kind of come up for us connected to that is this idea of, does Clery require campus security to be present? And so what we wanted to just touch on with that is, technically security departments and campus police are not required to exist under the Clery Act. However, if you are facing pressure from your institution around furloughing employees due to the fact that you don't have a lot of campus folks on campus physically right now, and there is this thought that there might be, less crime occurring or less need for capturing things, we would encourage you to, as I'm sure you're already doing, reflect on the idea that there still might be a need to have enhanced security services because since you have fewer folks living or working on campus, there could be an increased opportunity for crime to occur. And similarly, just because folks aren't around doesn't mean that they won't report information. And should they report information, it would still need to be included in that daily crime log. So just taking into account that reports will not stop just because folks are not physically on campus. And, unfortunately, the threat of crime or violence will also not erase just because there are fewer people on campus. Please note, too, that we know it's an unprecedented time for campuses to be reflexive and responsive to these types of needs. So we understand that these questions might be more easily said or answered than done right now, and we totally understand that. It's helpful to remember some basics with the daily crime log, although we would imagine if some of these are less able to happen right now due to a lack of staff, we would document that is happening should you ever need to defend or explain that to the Department of Education. So for example, in theory, in addition to the daily crime log, should be recorded within 2 business days of the reporting of that information. So you do have a bit of time for the requirements to get information added, but if you're experiencing delays because you have a very low amount of dispatch or your top priority is not making sure the daily crime log is up to date right now, I would document why there is limited ability to ensure that requirement is being met in the way it should. But if you are able to maintain that information, that is certainly helpful for folks that are remote so that they still have an idea of what's going on. This might be a time where, too, if your daily crime log has only been hard copy and has not been online, you might be forced with thinking through whether or not you have to make it online. There is nothing in the requirements that says that. There has been no additional guidance as of yet from the Department of Education that says that you must do that. So I would, just take that for what it is, document the best of what you're doing right now so that you have that information should you need it in the future. And just so you know, too, cases of COVID-19 are not considered crimes. However, you may have crimes related to the outbreak, as we just discussed. So just keeping in mind, you would not need to indicate reports of COVID-19 outbreak as an entry on your daily crime log per se in and of itself. Abby, I have not been looking at any questions that have been coming through just as I was going through those points. So is there anything you would like to address there?
I think that's a really good question that's tied to geography, but we can hold it until later on in the webinar just to get through this initial content, and then we'll bring it in at the end.
Okay, great, awesome. Thank you. So I'm just going to move into reporting real quickly here, and this is also connected to this idea of CSAs. So the reporting piece that is just important to remember is that, as you just said, in general, people still may want or have things to report. So I would be thinking through, we would encourage you to think through, as I'm sure you're already doing or have already done, encouraging folks or reminding folks that there are ways to report remotely or virtually. If you have not thought through that option, we would highly recommend thinking through that, because there very well might be a need to report in some capacity. Similarly, I would be preparing dispatch or your colleagues that are receiving those reports in any capacity to follow up receipt of a report with information about what that individual can expect to happen next in terms of follow-up or an investigation. Even as we're going to get into this in a moment, disciplinary procedures, we recognize that might be happening and evolving in real time, and that is totally okay. I would rather hear that from an institution than hear nothing at all. So just acknowledging that, thank you for reporting this. This is what we're doing with this information at this time. And connected to, just general crime reporting, unfortunately, due to the rhetoric that has come up around coronavirus, there has been an increase around racism and acts of hate or bias incidents against both Chinese Americans in general and international students connected to institutions of higher education. And so just as with any crime, we would encourage you all to remind folks of your institution's bias incident policy and options for reporting hate crimes. There are certain distinctions between hate crime classification under the Clery Act, which is very specific and sometimes even a narrow way of thinking about hate crime reporting, and bias incidents in general. And we do have a couple of resources through the Clery Center that help to distinguish between those two things if that's something that you would find helpful. Those can be found through our National Campus Safety Awareness Month website. But the important thing that we would recommend stressing right now is that it is important to report anything that is happening, whether that's online, whether that is in conversations that are happening in text between friends or on social media, or in chat rooms for classes that are now taking place, that is connected to hate or bias-related behavior, so that the institution can make determinations on additional next steps, whether that step involves classifying that incident as a hate crime under the Clery Act, which is just one in a number of options to address and respond to that type of behavior. So in connection to that, I wanted to just talk briefly about CSAs, because we did get a question regarding CSAs. So the question was, if, for example, resident assistants are no longer working, would they still be considered CSAs? This concern comes from, a student who is taking classes remotely discloses a Clery crime to their now former resident assistant. So, what we would say is, as long as they're still recognized by the institution as a resident assistant, they would still be considered a campus security authority. This applies even when people are on campus and living on campus. So an RA is not only considered a CSA when they are on duty and performing rounds at night. When you put that CSA hat on, you are functioning as a CSA all the time, unless you're in one of those exempt categories where you might be taking the hat on and off. So for example, a resident assistant, technically, if somebody discloses something to them at a party or a gathering, not realizing they're an RA, the RA still has an obligation to pass that information along, as uncomfortable as that requirement might feel. And so in this situation, while they are, not performing the duties of an RA in a traditional sense, if somebody is disclosing information to them, the expectation would still be that they pass that information along as a CSA. What might get interesting here is, as campuses moving into the later part of what would be this spring semester or into the summer, where they might remove appointments of individuals being resident assistants at some point. And so if that happens, that could very well change things in terms of obligations or things like that. But I would say that's probably lower on your list of considerations right now. Informing people when they are no longer a CSA is not the thing that I would be stressed about worrying as much right now. However, if somebody was going to push back and say the reason I didn't report was because I was told I'm no longer a resident assistant, that very well might be something they could hang their hat on. So I would say it's really important for those of you that are connected to reports or training or educating campus security authorities to be connected to the folks that are determining whether or not people are considered employees right now, or whether or not they're considered functional members of the institution right now, because certainly employment is not a condition only that makes somebody a CSA, but whether or not individuals are considered functioning members of the campus community right now in any capacity would help to determine if they should be considered functionally CSAs. So it's really helpful to keep those lines of communication open between you and folks that are making those types of decisions. Again, it might not be the highest priority right now, and we certainly understand that, but just something to file away and think about as you move forward in the coming days and weeks. Abby, would you add anything to that CSA part before I turn it over to you for a second with reporting?
No, I wouldn't.
Okay. All right, so then I'm going to pass it back over to Abby, who's going to talk to you a little bit about reporting considerations specifically for dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking.
Thank you so much. And some of what Laura's already been talking about obviously would extend to cases of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. In 2013, the Clery Act added additional prevention, reporting, and disciplinary procedures for these 4 areas. And for most of the campuses, if not all of the campuses on this call, the jurisdiction for your policies that address dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking likely apply to situations that occur off campus but are still impacting that person's educational experience. So we always like to highlight that Clery geography is typically not something that's considered for the purposes of the jurisdiction of your policy, particularly because of the intersection with what are at least the current regulations for Title IX. And we know that right now your students and employees might be looking for additional resources because some individuals right now are being isolated with an abuser, or many individuals, as we know, are being triggered by this required isolation, especially if they've experienced violence where they had a loss of control or they felt trapped as a part of that experience. I know just by looking at the names on the list, we have quite a few campus grant program grantees on the call today, and I know that these are things that you all have been thinking about as all of your institutions are navigating this experience. So similar to what Laura's just been sharing, you just want to think about some of the unique circumstances or the unique experiences of people experiencing dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking, and what are some of the moments or what are some of the specific information that they might really need at this moment. And some of you are really thinking both from an immediate safety point of view. So what are the immediate safety risks that some might be experiencing that may not have been the case while they were physically on campus, as well as what are the ways in which we're continuing to educate them throughout the remainder of the semester. We know we talked to a lot of campuses that were really disappointed, for lack of a better word, because we're going into Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and you've been working so hard to prepare different educational resources and opportunities for students and employees. So I think, one, we just want to acknowledge, I think, the grief that all of us are going through to some extent in plans that we had and things that we wanted to do to be able to support our community that we're not able to do in the same way. And while there's not a solution for that, I think it's important to name it because it is something that we're going through collectively in many different ways. And for campuses, what's been really inspiring to watch as we see institutions respond to this is to them really center that experience of their students and their employees and thinking about how are we going to adapt what's available to us right now. So whether that's looking at how can one make a report and what steps might they expect next if someone chooses to report dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. I know there's been kind of conversation in the field of are we going to see fewer reports because of this, or certainly, Clery geography is impacted because it's so tied to what the institution owns or controls. So what does that mean for our statistics? And I just encourage you to maybe take a step away from that perspective and think about, one, we might find that because people have a moment where they're removed from the community, they might actually start to explore reporting something that maybe they hadn't reported before they left campus that occurred within the campus community, but they felt as though they didn't have the emotional space or the time to be able to make that report. So what are the different mechanisms in which somebody can make a report? Is that really clear to the members of our community? What written explanation of rights and options do we afford to reporting parties if and when a report comes in? And are there things that we should be updating the community with if there are certain procedures that have had to be altered or updated in the short term, particularly addressing these unique circumstances that we didn't anticipate? And so much of your work with victims, survivors of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking is about how do we create transparency, how do we set some expectations about what they might expect next. So we'd really encourage you to think about that in relation to addressing the needs as you see them right now. And the same certainly also extends to some of your prevention and your education. So you might have had a lot planned around things like bystander intervention, some of which might continue, and some of which you might be asking the bigger question of, well, what type of content does my institution need from me right now? Because there's so many new questions and challenges that they're facing. So maybe your bystander intervention, if you're still doing some sort of digital outreach, maybe it's looking more at, well, what are some things that bystanders might need to know about helping to identify if a friend or a family member might be in an abusive relationship because folks are so isolated right now? What are the ways in which we're doing awareness about what these types of incidents look like or about our policies and our procedures? Because maybe we'll be prioritizing some of those or the self-care programs that we are working to make available within our communities so that they have access to the resources that we're seeing from our campus community that they're looking to seek out right now. And that also means being able to stay connected to some of those local and state and national resources, because some of the partners that you might work with regularly to provide various services through the campus community, they're going to be impacted by this as well. And we'll talk about that a little bit further as we explore kind of supporting students and employees more broadly. But before we do that, I want to just pause and hand it back over to Laura briefly so that she can talk a little bit about disciplinary procedures, because we know that that's something that's front of mind for many of you as well.
Thank you so much, Abby. And, I just wanted to, before I jump into disciplinary procedures, do you agree that it might be good to address that geography question right now?
Oh, great. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. We can tackle this one together. But for the group, I can read this to you. So we received a question that said, as we condense our remaining students residing on campus, which I know for many of you this might be the case. You might have students that just have nowhere else to go or are unable to get home, whether that be domestically or internationally right now. And so this question says, as we condense our remaining students residing on campus, a number of them will be in a hotel for the time being. I'm fairly confident that our campus police department has now designated this as an on-campus site in terms of patrol, calls for service, and reporting. My computer is playing around. This has been communicated to local police. So is it safe to assume that we now consider this an on-campus location or student housing? Would we only do so during the time students remain there and it's being patrolled by our campus police, or for all of 2020? So this is a great question, but it really is a good reminder that, for some things we can go back to our roots with Clery. So for something like this, if you're using a hotel for housing students, whether in the interim or long-term, some of this answer would depend on the physical proximity of that hotel to your on-campus geography, because if it was within that 1 mile, it very well might still be considered on campus. And then now if it's going to be providing on-campus student housing, it would be considered on-campus student housing for the time it's functioning in that capacity. If this location is more than 1 mile from your core campus, or from your on-campus boundaries rather, then this very well might be considered non-campus property. And so for the length of time that is functioning as something for which you have, for the length of time that it's serving as a housing facility for your on-campus students would be the length of the time that you would be considering it either on-campus student housing, if it's close enough, or a non-campus location. And so that is important to know, because this is an aspect of Clery geography that's real in that it can be evolving and organic throughout the year, and you would want to be noting if there are any reports of crime that come from that location, et cetera. So I hope that answers that in the short term for you, and then if there's anything else that is a follow-up for that question for the individual that sent that, please feel free to follow up in an email to myself or Abby. But then,
and
yeah,
Laura, can I tie in another geography one that came in that I feel like this is probably a good spot to address it? And I apologize because I clicked out of the initial question, so I'm not going to be able to use the exact language that this person raised. But essentially, someone had sent us a question noting that for the purposes of their remote working requirements, essentially there's some language in their policies that extends the operations of the institution to an employee's home. And so they were wondering whether or not, and for the person that plugged this in initially, if you want to copy and paste that question back in to help guide or give some context, that would be great, but hopefully kind of what I'm communicating makes sense. So the question they had raised is, because we're using this kind of language, does that mean that now those employees' homes would be considered a clear reportable location if there's a report of stalking behavior, for example, that the person receives in their home, but that alternately they would have received had they been present on campus in normal circumstances? And so the response that we gave privately there, but that I think is important to share here, is there hasn't been any public guidance to our knowledge regarding how or whether to make some of those Clery geography adjustments for this particular time frame. Typically, Clery geography is only going to extend to those locations that you own or control, or certainly those locations that are under control by a student organization officially recognized by the institution. So in a normal circumstance, say you have an employee that is operating or doing part of their work from home, and they would receive a message that would be a stalking message. If it didn't occur in Clery geography, it wouldn't be reported in your statistics. Now, a tie to this too is that the Department of Education really talks about the difference between space and program agreements. So there are sometimes agreements that certainly give you control over a certain program, or in this case, employees are going to be operating a certain program, but that wouldn't actually give the institution control over physical space. So we'd encourage you to keep an eye out for additional guidance from the Department of Education. We would say typically what's being described here likely would not fall under Clery geography. There typically is not a control for physical space, especially if it's the home of an employee. But we certainly, as an organization, will continue to pay attention to anything formal that the Department of Education puts out if there are additional considerations that you need to make, and we'll be sure to share that with all of you. So Laura, I just want to see if you have anything to add to that, and if not, you can go ahead and jump into disciplinary proceedings.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Abby. I know we're running low on time here, so I don't have anything else to add for that geography piece, and thank you so much for bringing that up. That was a really great question and good thinking through from that question asker, so whoever sent that. Thanks so much. So just moving into our last couple of reminders or suggestions and resources here. So disciplinary procedures in general. From our understanding, many campuses have made some decisions around whether or not they will pause proceedings for certain types of concerns, or whether they will continue with investigations and disciplinary proceedings for other types of cases. Some campuses, to our knowledge, have paused cases that are anything besides dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or other Title IX types of investigations, and have paused those at least for the time being. Other campuses that we are aware of have continued all operations in all cases, and some places have paused all investigations and proceedings. So we would say whatever you are choosing to do right now, we do not have any more formal guidance from the Department of Education on what they are expecting or wanting you to do. However, what we would recommend is being transparent with your campus community about what you are doing, especially as that might evolve over time right now. From a Clery lens, the most important thing would be to share with those that are reporting that they are a victim or survivor of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking, that they are getting information on their rights and options in writing. And so if those rights and options are going to be slightly different now that everybody is remote, and by different I just mean in terms of how they would access those rights and options, because certainly all things that should be a right or an option should still be in place, you would want to make sure you're really explicit about sharing that information. We have two great resources that we wanted to connect you with as well, connected to this topic. So the SUNY Student Conduct Institute did two really helpful webinars, Friday the 20th and Monday the 23rd. The recording of the webinar held on the 23rd is available through SUNY's SCI website, which we linked to in the blog that we posted last week. That has been linked in this call for you all. And that was really helpful in just reviewing some considerations in general around disciplinary proceedings and things you might want to communicate or start thinking about whether or not you need to make a decision on. And then similarly, the Association for Student Conduct Administration is hosting a 5-week course where they're having daily chats each day that are different topics that are connected to considerations around student conduct during this time of existing remotely and dealing with response to COVID-19. So I would highly recommend checking out those daily conversations, which are also serving like these as like group strategy sessions. In addition to that, Abby, I know you have some resources to touch on, and then we wanted to just leave folks with one reminder that they could anticipate connect to the annual security report.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've covered a lot of these already. We just wanted to echo, especially towards the end here, that we know that law enforcement in particular have been facing a lot of unique circumstances because they are, at many of your institutions, those of you in law enforcement or public safety, are a part of that group that Laura mentioned at the beginning of essential personnel. And so IACLEA has been sharing some really useful resources for law enforcement officers. If you're not already, we'd really encourage you to follow them on Facebook and on Twitter and stay connected with those updates. There's been a lot of really useful tips for law enforcement responding to situations, both in their own health and safety considerations and also, you know, navigating the fact that we know that we're seeing a rise in domestic violence incidents, an increase in individuals purchasing handguns, and so there are additional safety considerations. For everyone, remember, as we were saying a little bit earlier, that national hotlines, from what we're seeing, are still operating. So you'll want to make sure to stay connected with some of those national resources, particularly things for for sexual violence or domestic or dating violence, that victims may be able to call and access support, even if it's not a local center, depending on what the circumstances are. And also just to make sure to stay connected with any changes in protocol related to accessing medical care. So we know that typically we might recommend that somebody gets a sexual assault forensic examination, but with hospitals certainly being, with hospitals navigating a high number of people coming in relation to COVID-19 concerns, many hospitals have different protocol, as do local doctors, for example, as to how they plan to respond in these circumstances. Unfortunately, based on the conversations we're having with campuses, we know that that doesn't mean that the sexual assault or the violence is not still occurring, so there's still a need for it. We know that advocates are still responding to a number of cases. Law enforcement is still responding to a number of cases, so making sure to stay in touch with your community as to any changes in protocol that are going to influence the type of advice and recommendations you're giving to victims, survivors at this time. Last but not least, we just wanted to mention that a question that's been coming in is also for those of you who are kind of forward-thinking to the annual security report this year. Many of you were already working on information that you compile, both in your campus crime statistics and in the policy statements themselves. We anticipate that this is likely going to be an area where there's going to be some flexibility from the Department of Ed if an institution is unable to issue an annual security report. It's possible that they might come out at some point and say that it's not going to use its enforcement authority to sanction an institution for late distribution, but I should be very clear that that has not yet been declared, and if it does, we will be sure to share if anything of that nature goes out. So in the absence of that, we would really encourage you to, if you can still be getting your ASR out on the regular timeline, certainly we would encourage you to do that, but we know that a lot of you are navigating circumstances that might stand in the way of doing that. So you'll want to make sure that you are able to issue that ASR as soon as possible, reasonable based on what is likely within your community, and then also just document that reason for the delay. So although it sounds somewhat obvious as to why there might be a delay, the reasons for that might be unique to your campus. So it could be something like an inability to access printing, ID resources, or IT resources, excuse me, are limited in order to actually post the ASR, or delays in getting that statistical information from local law enforcement who are also overwhelmed in helping to navigate this national crisis. And so for those of you who are already thinking about the ASR, we just wanted to get you thinking about documentation if there is a delay, although certainly for those of you who don't feel as though that's going to happen or are still moving forward based on your initial schedules and timelines, we encourage you to stay connected. We are always happy to help with technical assistance. And certainly those of you who are members, remember that April is an ASR review month. So if that's a resource that you're exploring right now as you're navigating a lot of many different things related to COVID-19, that's certainly our training and technical assistance is still an option for you. So with that, I want to hand it back over to Laura to wrap up any questions she might have seen come in, any clarification she might want to give to anything that I just said, and to close us out.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Abby. And thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. You know, we are hoping to have future communications and initiatives to support all of your work as things continue to evolve with COVID-19. So please follow Clery Center on social media and check back in on our website for additional updates as we post more blogs or share more informational resources like calls like this one. And thank you so much for the questions you have submitted. If you did not get anything answered today that you are hoping to get some support with, please feel free to email myself or Abby directly, and we will be happy to circle around with you to get you that information. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for all of the work you are doing every day, and we look forward to supporting you in the future.